Alright, hi everyone. Today we're going to be learning about some skeleton stuff. So instead of an actual lecture, PowerPoint lecture, I thought I'd just come in and show you the models. Stella is here with me because she was throwing a fit when I was leaving. So yeah, so we're going to go through the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. I'll do the axial skeleton first. It's the first lab this week, and then the appendicular will be the second lab for this week. They kind of go together, obviously. It's a skeleton. So I'm going to show you as much as I think you'll be able to see on the camera. There's some little features that I'm just going to kind of skip over because I don't think you're really going to be able to see them. But in your lab manual, there's really good diagrams with pictures of skulls and stuff that you'll be able to see all the little, like the jugular, foramen, carotid canal, those type of small features. For the quiz this week, there will be both quizzes. There'll be actual pictures of the bones that I'm showing you with stuff labeled. So it's really important that you can identify not just on a diagram, but on like pictures of an actual bone. A lot of the bones you're going to be seeing are real human bones. They're from human donors, which is kind of cool that we're able to have those. So normally you can actually like touch them, and it's really cool to feel, you know, the bony feel, but me showing them is going to have to do for today. Alright, so axial skeleton, this lab starts, part of the lab manual talks about like different features of bones. So a lot of times, you know, features are named if they're like a little hole. It could be called a foramen. So any little hole is, you know, jugular foramen, etc., etc. There's different foramens. So that terminology list is super helpful because you'll see that a lot of the same types of features, processes have similar names, just different based on like where they're at. So take a look over that. I think there's like a chart in your lab manual. But then we start by talking about skeletal histology. I'll post, I think, a PowerPoint with like pictures and stuff. So on there I'll post a histology slide, but we also have this model that's showing you an osteon. So an osteon is this entire circular feature of the bone. And in the osteon you have right down the middle what's called a central canal. So you have different vasculature flowing through there, nerves, stuff like that. So you have veins and arteries, a bunch of different stuff flowing through the central canal. And around this you have this circular structure of the bone. And as the bone's forming, you'll talk about the physiology a lot more in lecture. This is kind of super watered down. You end up with these little gaps. So you can see these red, they're actually holes. So those are called lacunae, the little like red gaps. So this would be a lacunae too. Lacunae means lake. So I think of those little red, they're little red lakes. And in each lacunae, you have an osteocyte. So those little blue dots are osteocytes. And those are the individual bone cells. So the osteocytes are in the lacunae. And in an osteon, you have multiple lacunae with multiple osteocytes. Right? So lacunae are the lake. Osteocytes are the little blue dots within the lake. And then connecting the lakes, you have like these rivers. That's how I like to think of it. Those are called caniculi. So any river leaving the lake is caniculi. And again, in lecture, you'll talk about the importance of those. But again, lacunae with an osteocyte and the caniculi connecting. Right? So that's all the anatomy you're going to have to know for lab. You'll see this model on the quiz and also a picture of the actual tissue side, like in histology, but with maybe some of the stuff labeled, not just identifying. Okay, so that's skeletal histology. We're going to move on next, talk about the cranial bones. So we have two different skulls. They're the same, just this one's colorful, this one's plain white. I'm going to try to show you most of like the major bones on the colorful ones so you can see it a little bit easier. But there will be pictures of this plain white one, so it's important that you don't just memorize the colors. So start with the cranial bones. So the cranial bones are the bones that are going to make up the cranium, right? So the part that's going to be like covering your brain. So on your skull, you have your cranial bones, which we'll talk about, and then also your facial bones. So those are two distinct categories of bones, and in all the questions on the quiz, it's going to say identify the cranial bone or identify the facial bone. So that right there is going to help you narrow down, you know, what bones it's talking about. You're going to know what the cranial bones are and know what the facial bones are. So that's going to help you narrow it down when answering questions. Okay, so all the cranial bones and facial bones, there's the name of the bone, and then there's also going to be some specific features, so little things on the bones, little markings, stuff like that that you're going to have to know. On your handout, I organized it so that you have like the bone name, and then anything that's like indented under that bone is a feature of that bone, right? So from the temporal bone, you have all of these features coming off of the temporal bone, right? So just to show you, the temporal bone is this brown one. So for example, a feature you have to know is a styloid process. So you see that's brown because it's part of that temporal bone. Okay, so on your handout, it's organized pretty well, I think, to kind of help you find where stuff is. So if you can't find it, you at least know where to start looking. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the names of the bones first. The cranial bones and the muscles over the skull and the lobes of the brain all have the same name. So if you learn it once, later in the semester you'll be good. So this orange bone on the front of your skull is your frontal bone. The top of your skull, you have two parietal bones. Back of your skull is the occipital bone. So frontal, parietal, occipital, and on each side by your ears, you have your temporal bone. Okay, so just one frontal and one occipital, but two parietal and two temporal. So those are the major ones when you think of the cranial bones, what you're going to see. Those are also the same names as the lobes of the brain. So where each lobe of the brain under the skull is named based on where it's at. You also have two other bones that are considered cranial bones. You have your sphenoid, which is this red guy on the side there. And then, it's going to be kind of hard to see. So the sphenoid, you can see the red guy, and also on the back of the eye, I don't know if it's light enough for you to see, but in the back of the eye is the sphenoid. And then the last one is the ethmoid bone, which is this yellow guy on the inside of the eye. Right, so in the deep part of the eye sockets, sphenoid and ethmoid. I don't know if you can see that. Okay, so I'm going to go to this guy quick. So the sphenoid bone, again, is this bone right on the side there. If you take off the top of the skull, so if you do kind of a transverse cut, I don't know if it's exactly parallel with the ground, but pretty close. On the inside of the skull, you can see this right here is your sphenoid bone. So it kind of gives this butterfly shape. So you have out here, all of this stuff in here is all your sphenoid. So you can see it from the side and on the inside of the eye, but also it's kind of hard to manipulate, but really good on the inside of the skull here. So that's your sphenoid. The ethmoid, again, is the one that's right in the middle of the eye here. Kind of hard to point to, this guy. And you can also see that from the top, but it's just this little section up here. Okay, so those are the cranial bones. So now I'm going to go through and talk about some of the important features. So the first features are on the temporal bone. And again, I'm just going to show you the ones that I think you'll actually be able to see on this. So the first one is the styloid process, which we already kind of talked about. This really pointy spike. I remember this, I think styloid, like stiletto. If you know, a stiletto is a really pointy like heel shoe. So stiletto is this really, styloid process is really stiletto shaped spike. Okay. We have the zygomatic process. So we haven't talked about it yet, but this orange facial bone is the zygomatic bone, your cheekbone. So on your temporal bone, you have the zygomatic process, which is this kind of bridge-looking structure going towards the zygomatic bone, right? So zygomatic process of your temporal bone. Next, we have the mastoid process, which is this process behind the styloid, so posterior. That's just this little bump here. It's the mastoid process. Mandibular fossa, again, we haven't talked about it, but this is called the mandible. So the point where that attaches, I don't know if this comes off. It should, yeah. The point where the mandible attaches is called the mandibular fossa. So any divot is considered a fossa. So on here, where the mandible attaches is your mandibular fossa. Carotid canal, you're never going to be able to see on this. Look in your book. External acoustic meatus, I'm going to show you on this guy. So again, whoa. So again, here is your maybe temporal bone. We don't need that, whatever. External acoustic meatus is this hole here. So that's where your ear canal is entering your skull, right? External acoustic meatus. And if you follow that in, it's going to be kind of hard to see. If you follow that in, you can see this little hole. If you were in lab right now, you could see that these two holes like attach. That's your internal acoustic meatus. So they're really lined up. You could stick a pencil through and it would go through the external to the internal acoustic meatus. Okay? So those are all the ones for the temporal bone. Occipital bone, again, the occipital bone is this one in the back of your head. Okay? And it also wraps down as like on the bottom of your head. So you can see on the back, but also like the bottom of your skull is the occipital bone. So we have the occipital condyles, which if you see this big hole, something you need to know as well, that's the foramen magnum. That's where your spinal cord, your brainstem and spinal cord leave your skull. So on either side of the foramen magnum, you have these two like soft spots. They're not actually soft, they're smooth. Those are your occipital condyles. Okay. And then jugular foramen, you're never going to be able to see. On your sphenoid bone, so again, you can see the sphenoid on outsides, but also it's this butterfly shape inside here. You have what's called the sella turcica. So this little divot right in the middle of the sphenoid is your sella turcica. And that's actually where your pituitary gland of your brain, let me get a brain model. So you have, on the bottom of your brain, this little thing hanging down is your pituitary gland. So that sits right inside, if you can kind of see, it would sit right inside of your sella turcica there. So it's a little bony structure that protects your pituitary gland. Okay, what else do we have? On our sphenoid, we have superior orbital fissures and an optic canal. So again, you can see your sphenoid on the inside of your eye. I don't know if there's a good way to show. So you can see there's like two holes on the inside of your eye. That little round hole, this guy that I'm kind of like plugging up, that is your optic canal. So a perfect round hole at the back of your eye. You also have these like boomerang shaped guys. You can kind of see it on this eye better at this angle. That's your superior orbital fissure. Right, the boomerang shaped guy, superior orbital fissure. Perfect little round hole is the optic canal. And those technically are both part of your sphenoid bone. Okay? Ethmoid bone, again on the inside of the eye right there, but also on the top of the skull you can see the ethmoid bone there. So this top part right there, that is the cribriform plate. This whole feature, if anything's pointed and it says name the feature in this area, it's a cribriform plate. There's more specific parts, but we're to say cribriform plate. And then the nasal conchae. So technically inside of your nose, your ethmoid is that yellow bone again. So if you look inside of your nose, you can see the ethmoid on the bottom there. So you have two nasal conchae on your ethmoid bone. Your superior one, which you can't see on this model actually. And then your middle nasal conchae, which is that top ridge in the nose. So there's technically one above that. You can't see it on these models, but you have middle nasal conchae, and then the bottom one's your inferior nasal conchae. Okay? Good so far? Questions? I hope you can see this. I hope this is helpful. And then separating your cranial bones, you have what are called sutures. So these little like orange lines are the sutures. So as your skull is developing, obviously it doesn't start as like one solid little guy. So these sutures are where the bones kind of like fuse together. And they all have names because this is anatomy and everything has a name. So let's see, we'll start with the coronal suture. So this is the front of the skull, right? Your frontal bone and your parietal bones. So what would be in the frontal or coronal plane, this line here, is your coronal suture. Okay, so coronal suture, separating your frontal and your parietal bones. Okay, so there might be the suture labeled, or it might say which suture separates frontal and parietal. So you need to know coronal. Our sagittal suture is actually in a mid-sagittal area. So remember, sagittal separating right and left. So the sagittal suture goes right down the sagittal plane and separates your two parietal bones. Lambdoid suture. So parietal bones, this is occipital. So this suture at the back here is your lambdoid suture. And it kind of looks like the Greek lambda. I think that's like a Greek letter or something. So that's the lambdoidal suture, separating your occipital and parietal. And then the last one, separating your temporal and parietal. So this suture over here is your squamous suture. And I kind of think your temporal bone looks kind of like squamous shape, kind of pancake shape. So your squamous suture is on the side and is separating your temporal and parietal. Okay, good? Okay, now we're talking about the facial bones. Let's go over them quick. Your jawbone is your mandible. You have your maxilla, which is this purple bone, which is like kind of like your under your nose area, and also on the bottom of your, let me take the mandible off. Maxilla can be seen also on the bottom of your roof of your mouth. All right, so maxilla. Palatine bones are these little pink guys that make up the back part of your mouth. That's the only place you can see them. So that makes up it's called the hard palate, the top of your mouth, your maxilla and palatine bones. Zygomatic bones are the orange guys on your cheek. Zygomatic. And we talked about the temporal bone has a zygomatic process. Your zygomatic bone has a temporal process. So the part of the zygomatic bone going towards the temporal bone is your temporal process of your zygomatic bone. You have your zygomatic process of temporal bone. And those make up, this is called the zygomatic arch. Very confusing, I understand. Okay, inside the eye, so the yellow one, remember, is the ethmoid. But right on the very inside of the nose is this brown, it's like a light tan. That's your lacrimal bone. So you have it on either side. I remember this, it's by like your tear ducts, lacri, I think lacrimal, I think of cry, it's right by your tear ducts. Your nasal bones are the white bones right at the top, the bridge of your nose, your two nasal bones. Vomer, right on the inside of your nose, kind of hard to see. This little pointy boy is your vomer. And then you have your inferior nasal conchae, which I already showed you on the other model, but is this like white, I don't know if you can see this at all, this white ridge on the inside of your nose. So remember, you can only see the middle and inferior nasal conchae. Okay, that's it for the skull. Again, there's a few things I skipped over that are hard to see, but you can look in your book and see those. Stella, what are you doing? All right, ribs. Coffee first. What are you doing, Stella? What you doing, huh? You want to show them the ribs, Stella? Come here. Show the ribs. Come here. We have a guest speaker. She knows a lot about ribs. So, what are these ribs down here? What are those, Stella? Those are floating ribs. So these ribs you can see in the back aren't connected to anything, so those are considered floating ribs. At the top of our rib cage, we have ribs that are directly attached to our sternum. Those are true ribs. And then there's also some ribs down here that don't directly attach, but they kind of merge together in this costal cartilage and then attach. These are false ribs. So true ribs are ones that are going to directly attach to the sternum. False ribs don't have direct attachment points, but do attach eventually through costal cartilage. And then floating ribs in the back don't attach at all. Again, this is broken. Whoops, I should have grabbed a different one. This part that's broken, the part where the ribs are attaching, that's costal cartilage, which you should know what type of cartilage that is made up of. I'm not going to tell you, but you should know that from the histology. Okay, so your ribs obviously are going to attach to the sternum. That's called your sternal end. And then they're going to attach on the opposite side to your vertebrae. That's your vertebral end. So if you look at an individual rib, we have the, this whole part of the rib is the shaft. This little groove you can see, that's the costal groove. And that is going to be facing down, that's on the bottom of the rib. So if I show you an individual rib or have a picture of it, you should know what's the sternal end and what's the vertebral end. You can see this side is like really bumpy, this side is smooth. So the bumpy side, this like big bump is called a tubercle. This whole side is the head, the bumpy side is the head of the rib, and that's gonna be the vertebral end. So if you see where these are attaching to the vertebrae, if you see the ribs themselves, they are bumpy. That's the head of the ribs back here. So the vertebral end is the head or the bumpy side with that tubercle. Okay, and then the smooth side, you can see here, where it attaches to the costal cartilage, the sternum, that's going to be super smooth, right? So that's going to be the sternal end. Okay, I think that's everything with ribs. Next, in this we have our vertebrae. My camera always dies. I don't know why I don't charge it ahead of time, but that's okay. So vertebral column obviously looks like this. These are your vertebrae. Kind of hard to see. We have 3 different types of vertebrae. So the top part closest to your skull, this is a terrible angle. These are your cervical vertebrae in your neck, cervical. The middle part is your thoracic vertebrae. So these orange guys are thoracic. And the red ones are your lumbar vertebrae. And then you have your sacrum, which is blue here, and the coccyx, which is your little tailbone, which is green. So you should know cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. But also if there's just a picture of one of the vertebrae, you should be able to identify which part of the vertebral column it comes from. It's pretty easy to do. I'm gonna get the correct ones. So all of your vertebrae are going to have a vertebral foramen, that hole in the middle, which is where your spinal cord travels through. So you see they all have that big hole. But your cervical vertebrae have these 2 little extra holes, your transverse foramen on either side. So if you look at this, you can see these little red spaghettis. Those are going through those transverse foramen. These are your vertebral arteries. So it only goes through your cervical vertebrae. So only your cervical vertebrae are going to have those extra 2 little transverse foramen holes on either side. Okay, so cervical, 2 little transverse foramens, and you have your vertebral foramen. And then you have thoracic and lumbar you need to be able to differentiate between. So again, I didn't talk about it, but this big thick part, those are the body. You have your vertebral foramen. On all your vertebrae, you're going to have a spinous process, which comes out and is going to be this very back ridge of your spine. So if you feel the back of your spine, those bumps, those are your spinous processes. Okay, so all vertebrae are going to have that. Even your cervical has spinous process. Okay, so spinous process, this part, your transverse processes are going to be the side parts here. But as far as thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, your lumbar vertebrae are going to be the biggest ones. So they're at the very bottom of your back. They're going to be the most weight bearing, so they need to be pretty hefty. So this guy here is your lumbar vertebrae, and this would be your thoracic. The way I remember them is if you look, I think lumbar looks like a moose, right? Because you see like the moose nose and little horns with antlers, whatever the hell. And then the thoracic looks like a giraffe. It's definitely more pointy, your spinous process, compared to the rounded spinous process of your lumbar vertebrae. Right, so thoracic looks like a giraffe, lumbar looks like a moose. Okay, so if you see just one that looks like a giraffe, it's pretty easy to identify as being thoracic. Moose, again, pretty easy to identify as being lumbar. Okay, I think I talked about, intervertebral foramen. So you have your vertebral foramen, which is in the middle, which is where your spinal cord goes through. You also have your intervertebral foramen. So when these are all stacked up on top of each other, there's going to be little holes on either side. So on each one you can't really see, but there is like a divot here, and these obviously don't go together. But if you were to stack them up, those little holes, they would create holes there, right? So that is your intervertebral, so between your vertebrae, foramen, a hole. And on your spinal cord, that's where your spinal nerves come out. So these little spaghettis are your spinal nerves extending from your spinal cord. So those are your intervertebral foramen on the sides. And then the last two things with your vertebrae you need to know. The first two vertebrae are cervical, obviously at the very top, but they are special. They look different from the rest, and they have special functions. So you have your atlas and axis vertebrae. So atlas is C1, or cervical 1, the first vertebrae. Axis is C2, cervical 2 vertebrae. I remember which one's which because they're in alphabetical order. Atlas, then axis. And on your atlas vertebrae, you have these really soft spots at the very top. Those are going to articulate with your occipital condyles on the bottom of your skull. So this would go articulate with your occipital condyles on the bottom of your skull, right? And that allows your head, those soft spots, allows your head to nod, okay? And then your axis, C2, has this, it's called a dens, that little pointy part that goes up. None of your other vertebrae obviously have any sort of thing like that. So your atlas goes on top of your axis, and you see how it goes, the dens kind of goes through the middle there. This allows your head to rotate side to side. Okay, so your dens, these articulate together to allow your head rotation side to side. Your atlas, these facets allow your head to nod up and down. So if you see one of these two, you should know, first of all, they're cervical because they have the transverse foramen. But you should know atlas has these big, super big facets on the top, and axis has the dens. Okay, and then the last part of axial skeleton is your sternum. Has some fancy names to it. So we already talked about it. Hopefully you all know that this is your sternum in the middle here. It has three different distinct parts. There's this top part, the middle part, and this little point on the bottom. They all have different names. The big middle part is the body of the sternum. This top part is called the manubrium. Manubrium, I don't know how to say it, but I say manubrium because that helps me spell it. But the manubrium, I remember it kind of looks like a top of a tie or whatever, and men wear ties. I don't know. That's how I remember it. Manubrium at the top, body, and then this bottom point is the xiphoid process. All right, and then the last thing, I don't have one because I lost it. I don't know where it's at, but you have a hyoid bone. Let's go on a little field trip. Does this have one? No. This guy? We need to find a hyoid bone. Okay, so this guy, oops, has a hyoid bone, so there's the skull, right?